Welcome back to another episode of the vlog. Today you find ourselves again at the lodge, and today's episode is special as it is branded the largest meetup game in Texas history. As you guys can see, we have a full house here at the lodge. No thanks to us, but we're gonna come over here, enjoy ourselves, and hopefully run good. We are in the 2-5 streets, I think is what we're playing. It might be like a 1K cap or something, but we'll figure it all out. Appreciate you guys as always. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Let's hop right into today's episode. Not a lot to get into. Let's kick it to me back at the studio to break down some hands. As originally promised, these hands are going to be going way faster as, the intros are going to be shorter, the vibes are going to be better, but this very first hand is a massive one, and we're going to have to catch up on the action. I'm in the double straddle. That means I have $20 out there blind. Again, we're playing 2, 5, 10, 20 in this hand. The button decides to open it up to $60, who's definitely a solid reg. It folds all the way to me in the double straddle, and I look down at 5, 7 of diamonds. Never going to be folding here, so I'm going to go ahead and make the call. And we're off to a flop out of position, and the flop comes 8, jack, deuce, 2 diamonds. When I decide to check, it actually comes a bit of a surprise to me when the opponent decides to check back. I'd imagine most of his button opening range is going to be c-betting here unless he has some form of showdown value. But anyways, for us, it doesn't really matter because we immediately get there when the turn comes the queen of diamonds. So now I've got to start bloating the size of this pot, and I have to do it fairly quickly. Around $130 or $140 out in the middle, and I've got to go close to 80 or 90% pot in this turn size bet. I decide to make it $110. The bluffs I'm going to have in my range are going to consist of an ace of diamonds or something like that. And I can definitely start polarizing myself on the turn because I'm almost only going to be leading hands that contain a diamond or that are a diamond on this turn card. Not likely to be leading out with 2 pair here. So I want to be going larger. My opponent thinks about it for a little bit before deciding to make the call, and we're off to a river card. The river comes a beautiful, beautiful blank as it's the 5 of hearts, giving us a pair. Not that we needed it because we have flush, but when the action's on me, I believe it's time to go massive. We've got to go really big, nearly 125% pot if I have to or I can. There's no other bet sizing I'd like to choose besides the old 420. I lead out for a $420 bet, a massive, massive sizing, and maybe don't try this at home, folks, but everything that I do comes from a place of a plan. My opponent goes deep into the tank before eventually deciding on a call. We flip over a hand. I'm almost positive I'm going to be good here every single time I get called. And my opponent shows nothing. He mucks. Awesome. Big hand on the first hand of the session. One of the early hands in the session. And hopefully that gears us into the right direction. Just want to briefly talk about hands that I'm targeting on that river. I'm targeting specifically a hand like aces, kings, ace queen, something of the sort. It's definitely going to be more landing on that 1 pair style holding. It's unlikely that our opponent has a set and doesn't bet or raise on any of the streets. So I think by going as polar as I did, I'm putting all those hands in a really tough situation. Obviously, if we get raised, we're almost never good here, and the opponent doesn't have very many credible bluffs. So that's kind of why I chose the sizing I did on the river. Following hand, we look down at ace 5 offsuit from the button. It folds over to me. Obviously going to be raising any ace from the button, especially against 2 fun players in the blinds. The flop comes jack 9 5. It does have 2 spades out there. When he decides to check it over to me, I decide to check it back considering I do have some showdown value, and we're off to a turn card that comes the 9 of hearts. This time the small blind leads for $25, and I pretty quickly decide to make the call considering my hand is again just too strong to fold. And a bunch of his random bluffs are going to be continuing here, or at least taking over the betting lead. On the river, things get a little more tricky as it comes to 4 of clubs. Again, the spade draws do brick out, all the straight draws brick out, but the opponent is still betting. I think there are going to be too many bluffs when we get over to this river and he leads out for $60. That is just too good of a price for me to fold, so I end up doing what I do best and making the call. My opponent shows jack 8 offsuit, and we do lose that hand, unfortunately. In the following hand, we're in the big blind. Middle position decides to make it $15. Late position decides to make the call, and I look down at ace 6 offsuit here from the big blind. Again, I'm going to go ahead and defend pretty much every ace here from the big blind, and just kind of play flops and see how well we can do. Makes things a little easier when the flop comes ace, king, 6, and there are 2 hearts and a club out there. I continue to play in flow by checking over to the initial raiser, who decides to c-bet here for $30. Gets back over to me, and I decide to use this as a check raise spot, considering that I will have a ton of random bluffs here, straight draws and flush draws, and I like to be pushing my opponent off his equity or getting him to call with aces that are inferior, obviously. He decides to think it over for a little bit before deciding to make the call. We're off to a turn card. The turn comes one of those really, really bad turn cards, as it comes the 10 of hearts. Although the one thing I will add is that being that it's the 10 of hearts, it does remove quite a few flush hands from his range. There's less Broadway flushes that are available besides specifically Queen Jack of hearts. Obviously, there's still an opportunity to have a hand like Queen 9 of hearts or 9-8 of hearts or 7-8 of hearts, but not as likely and a little less common for the person to bet that and then call a check raise on the flop. Again, it's not unheard of, but it's not too likely considering the way both of us have played the hand to this point. With all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and continue betting for value here, and I decide to bet $125. Again, I'm still targeting a hand like ace queen or ace jack, specifically a hand that also carries a heart on it. So if he has ace queen or ace jack, maybe with the ace, maybe with the jack or the queen of hearts. The river comes another pretty innocuous 5 of spades, so a pretty reasonable river card for us, all things considered. When it starts off on me, I'm not sure how to go on this spot. I'm considering going for a blocker size bet, and that's pretty much what I end up doing. I bet $135. Again, I just don't want to have to call a massive bet, and by going a little bit on the smaller side, I almost get all of his better 2 pairs sometimes to never raise me, and I can get all of his sets to just make the call. And obviously, I don't have to call a larger river size bet. If he raises ever, this is a snap fold, obviously, but he decides to do none of that. He decides to just call. We show over ace 6, and he shows ace king pretty confidently. So unfortunate cooler there, and being pretty fair to myself, I don't really mind how the hand really went down. This next hand is a great example of going 3 streets, so let's get right into it. In this hand, we look down at pocket jacks from the +1 position. I decide to raise to $25. There is no straddle out there, but in these Texas games, you got to make the price of poker a little more expensive. You can't entice everyone to make the call. The goal is to go heads up or 3 ways to a flop at most, not like 5 or 6 ways, what they like doing here in Texas. So that's why I choose to go a little bit on the larger side. Only the gentleman directly to my left, so under the gun +2, decides to make the call, and we're off to a flop. The flop comes deuce 7-3 rainbow. The action starts with me. This is not a great board texture for my range, but it is a good board texture for my exact hand. The only trouble is there's not a whole lot of hands that I can be getting value from that I can open from, and then somebody directly to my left in early position can call, but there are a couple of outstanding hands that I can still target. The only rough thing, and the one thing I will mention I think that is important, is that in a larger game with maybe like super killers and sharks, I'd actually like to turn my hand into a just check here sometimes, and then turn my hand into a check call, because I feel like against a really strong opponent or a really aggressive opponent, they can just blast off on 3 streets, and I don't mind playing against that. But I think in this game, I'm not looking to be super balanced or all that GTO. I'm looking to just extract as much money as I can. So I end up, after all of that, deciding to bet $30, and my opponent pretty quickly decides to make a call, and we're off to a turn that falls the 3 of diamonds. So it pairs the second card, which again is not usually great, but I don't see a ton of 3s in my opponent's range unless he has specifically ace 3 suited. But beyond that, there's just not a whole lot of 3s there that make up his range. I decide to bet once again for $80, going a little bit on the larger side here. Time to build the size of this pot, and my opponent pretty quickly decides to make the call. The river is a pretty interesting one as it comes to 8 of hearts, so if he has specifically a hand like 8-7 suited, he does improve the second pair, but again, my 2 pair would be better. It does remove some of the hands that I was targeting initially, which is like pocket 8s, which would be like pocket 8s that would be boating up here on the river. So the hands that I'm actually targeting here on this river do get a little more narrow. At this point, I'm targeting specifically a hand like pocket 10s, 8-7, ace-7 suited, 9-7 suited, which I think can make up my opponent's range. So not going to go with a really large bet size. I'm going to go something a little more on the value side. Don't need to polarize myself here. So I decide to bet
$140. My opponent goes into the tank for over 1 minute before deciding on a call. We decide to show our pocket jacks. My opponent pretty quickly decides to fold. This is an interesting situation where I think you can get lost in the sauce and maybe not go for all 3 streets of value, but I think by keeping our bet sizes very, kind of in line with the hands I'm targeting, I'm able to get 3 full streets of value on a board texture that might not really predicate that. In the following hand, we look down at ace 8 of hearts. The straddle is on in this hand. We decide to open from the cutoff to $30. Unfortunately, the only person that calls is the person that has position on us, being the button, and we're off to a flop heads up. The flop comes 9-5-4, and we 2-flop ourselves a beautiful flush draw. I decide to c-bet for half pot, $35 here, considering this is a fairly wet board texture, and I could see a lot of suited connector hands that would have like a pair and a gut shot here. So like I said, maybe betting a little bit larger would be the optimal play, but I'm going to live and be okay with the half size bet. My opponent decides to pretty quickly make the call, and we're off to a turn card. The turn comes at 10 of clubs, and at this point I decide to bet a little bit on the larger side. The reason being is hands that I would easily have here is a hand like 10-9. I could easily have a hand like Jack 10 going for a c-bet, or even ace 10 of hearts. And with all that being said, I want to be betting a little bit on the larger side, maybe making my opponent more likely to make a big fold. So I bet $85. My opponent pretty quickly again decides to make the call. The river hoping for a big one, so maybe like in 1, 2, 3. Thank you to everyone that liked, but because of you guys, the river's a 3 of hearts. So getting some of that vlogger and the community run good, as we now have the nuts on this board. In this spot, my opponent has around $300 in his stack, so I need to go pretty big here, I think, because I want to be polarized here. If I have is just the naked ace of hearts here, getting to the river, or some other kind of random bluffs, I would want to be going large to get him to fold what could be a hand as strong as 2 pair, or vice versa, getting a hand like that to make the call. So after a little bit of thinking, I decide to fall into the all-in sizing. He has about $300 in his stack, and he goes deep into the tank. Yes, we have another minute-long tank from our opponent on the river, and my opponent eventually decides on a fold. He would later tell me that he folded a straight, so I guess he had a hand like ace deuce or 6-7 and ended up folding the river. It's pretty unfortunate because if you're not willing to call off on a heart that makes your straight, then you shouldn't be calling the turn. But either way, it seems like we got the most value we were ever going to get, and we're going to be okay with that. We were betting with the best hand all the way. Unfortunately, this next hand, the video file was corrupt, and to prove it to you guys, I'm going to show you. You see that? That's a corrupted file. Anyways, this is the first time it's happened to me. But again, like I said, I like to show you guys all the parts of the session that help tell the story. Not everything is roses. Not every river came perfect for us. So let's go over this next hand. I look down at Jack 8 of clubs here from the middle position, and I decide to raise it up. It folds over to the button, who's again that stronger player we played against in that 5-7 of diamonds hand, and he decides to 3-bet here to $75. Folds back to me, and it's about $55 more for me to call. He picked a very nice sizing, I think so, but again, not going to be folding here considering we are both over $1,500 effective. So there are some implied odds if we can make a pretty big hand, and we're off to a flop. The flop comes ace jack 4 with 2 diamonds and a club. So we flop a backdoor flush draw as well as second pair. Not the best board texture of all time, but it's actually pretty reasonable considering we do have a pair. When I decide to check it over to him to continue playing in the flow of this hand, the opponent decides to c-bet for $60. Love his sizing here, love the smaller c-bets, and I especially love it because I can make the call pretty profitably here, hoping that the turn card adds some form of value to our hand. When it comes the 10 of hearts, so nothing really changes here for us, and a lot of his bluffs will have picked up some extra value or now have been made. When I check it over to him, he decides to bet $225, definitely sizing up here. He can definitely have a hand like King 10 of diamonds or Queen 10 of diamonds, picking up extra equity as well as still having a very nice bluffing candidate here. This again is a board texture that's just going to totally crush his range. He's going to have all the nutted hands, and it's less likely that I will. The only nutted hand that I can ever have here is going to be King Queen suited, and that's pretty much it. It's hard for me to have anything besides specifically that exact hand. I'm never going to really have jacks here probably, and it'll be pretty unlikely for me to continue with any weaker ace. So I love his sizing, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to fold to that sizing. We'll never know what he had, but you know, even if he didn't have me beat, I would assume that he would have had some really good equity against my hand. In this following hand, an early position player decides to make it $20. The really solid reg player who just happens to be on the button every time he's 3-bet makes it $75. A short stack from the small blind decides to go all in, and we look down at ace-queen offsuit. The all-in is for only $240, which makes it more likely that the opponent can be doing this a little wider than I usually would expect. I wouldn't assume him to only have aces, kings, or queens in this spot. So when it's back over to me, I'd like to play this a little more aggressive, and if I'm gonna go, I have to go all in to really not have the other players come in for a fair price. It's very likely that if I just call, I'm allowing the button or the early position player to make a move on me and get my free money out of the way. So I'd like to be the one to do the move making. After I decide to jam, both the early position player and the button pretty quickly decide to make the fold, and we're off to a flop. The flop comes king 9-4. My opponent pretty quickly exposes ace king of clubs. We're pretty much dead at this point, and the turn card comes a jack, giving us a little bit of hope, but the river comes a 3. So close, but no cigar. We're going to go ahead and give over a pretty sizable pot to our opponent here. Unlucky for us, it wasn't our turn to suck out. In this very next hand, I'm not going to hold back from the aggression just because it might not have worked out for us previously. My action style is always going to be the most important thing. I've got to save face here. Just because I lose doesn't mean I turn into a slow playing nit. My goal is to keep the environment fun, and especially since we're in a meetup game. The hijack decides to raise to $30. The cutoff makes the call, and we look down at queen jack of diamonds from the button. Like I said, my goal is to keep things aggressive, fun, action-packed, and if I can take down an extra $75 odd pre-flop without any resistance, why not take the opportunity? Worst case scenario, I get called and I'm in position. I decide to 3-bet here to $125. It folds back over to the cutoff player, should be a pretty easy fold from him, but he actually decides to defend. We're off to a pretty juicy flop here that comes ace king 7 with 2 diamonds. We flop Broadway draw as well as a flush draw. My opponent checks over to me, and he has around $650 left in his stack. I think about it for a little while, and I'm not sure how I would play this. If I have aces, kings, ace king, what would my best course of action be? Considering his SPR is currently around 2-1, I think that we're in a pretty interesting situation. I actually miscounted his stack before I made this play, if I'm being totally honest. I didn't see the stack of greens that were just to the right of his 3 towers of red. So at the very moment, I assumed he only had about $300 or $350. I couldn't see just off the top right. You can see very slightly the stack of reds. Just to the right of that was the greens. Not his fault, and I don't think it was my fault either. It was just a little bit out of my vision. Anyways, I ended up making a jam for $650, which is around 2 times the size of the pot. A little bit overkill and definitely not needed. I think a hand as weak as 1 pair is probably always going to fold here. Even ace jack or ace 10 is probably going to fold. And to be quite honest, that's not a bad thing. Obviously, those hands have us beat, and we're going to have to win a pretty big flip here. But a hand that's better than us, like has a set or any really massive draws, is probably always going to make the call. Anyways, after jamming $650, my opponent pretty quickly decides to make the call, which is fairly worrisome because at this point I can see he has about $650. Luckily, before we decide to do anything, we ask how many times we want to run it. My rule is always the same. I'll always go as many times as my opponent wants. My opponent pretty quickly notifies me that he's not accustomed to running it more than once.
It's up to you.
I don't care. I don't know how the game. I've actually never played so hard. They run it twice. I've never done that before, so I don't really care.
I'll allow you to choose whatever you like, whatever comes to mind.
I literally don't care. Do you want me to choose?
Sure.
All right.
And at that point, we leave it up to Wolfgang. And Wolfgang was kind enough to say, one time we're going for blood. Well, with that information being had, we're going to have to get pretty lucky here. Hit a diamond or a 10. Our opponent pretty quickly exposes pocket 7s for flopped bottom set. Unbelievable hand from him. The turn comes a brick, And the river comes a 3 of diamonds, and just like that, we scoop a massive pot in this meetup game, probably one of the biggest pots that has happened at our table. As the session is winding down, we get to one of the last hands of the night, and we look down at our hold buddy parking lot hand extraordinaire ace queen offsuit. I decide to raise to $25 here from middle position. The cutoff, the button, and the small blind all make the call, so it seems like I didn't make it large enough. The flop comes king, queen, jack with 2 clubs. I decide to c-bet here pretty small to $35. Again, going around a third of the size of the pot. Only the button decides to make the call, which is not all that great considering I will be out of position for the rest of the hand. But anyways, we're off to a turn card. The turn comes the deuce of clubs. So now I have the ace of clubs. I'm blocking what is for sure the nuts in 2 different spots, considering I'm holding an ace, which blocks the nut straight, and I'm holding the ace of clubs, which blocks the nut flush. I decide to go massive for $150, looking to get every hand that holds any type of equity out of there, especially hands that have us beat. There can be hands like 2 pair or a hand like king 10, and we're trying to get those hands out of there. My opponent pretty quickly decides to make the call, unfortunately, and we're off to a river, which comes the 10 of clubs. That's pretty outstanding because now we can go from betting for a bluff to betting for value. I'm going in between sizings, and I think on this river, it's very unlikely that I end up with a bluff. And if I do, I'd be betting fairly large. After a little bit of thinking, like I said, I decide to bet $450. And yet again, we have over 1 minute in the tank with our opponent. But this time, our opponent decides to make a tough laydown. Unfortunate for us there. Not too sure what he had. Like I said, I'd imagine by that river, he would almost certainly at least have 2 pair. The board texture was far too connected by that point. Unfortunately, he didn't have a baby club to maybe call us off with, but what can I say? Cannot complain for going runner because that's always funner. This is one of the few times where I look back at the video and I'm doing my hand recording and I give you guys my honest read at the table. At the time, I was thinking I should go large, but looking back on it now, I think obviously the play was to go really, really small and allow my opponent to bluff at the hand or allow my opponent to make a weak call with a 2-pair type holding. I think by going massive, my opponent's almost never going to make the call, and he can even exploitatively fold the second nuts. So looking back on it, I don't like my bet whatsoever. And that's just kind of food for thought. When you get there, you got to get the money sometimes too. So I think going smaller, betting like $150 to $200 was definitely the smarter play. Maybe even smaller to make my opponent react to the bet in a crazy way.
Like that, we are out of today's session. Woo! As you guys saw there, again, just seem to be getting into the mix here in Texas. I will not shy away from action. I'm happy to give it, and hopefully it's returned back in my direction. But anyways, let's talk a little bit about how this session went. I feel really good, actually. It's still really early, and the meetup game is still going, but as far as for me, I think it's going to close it out for the day for me. That's enough poker for the day. I think I'm going to get spent if I keep playing, so that'll wrap it up. But we were into today's game for $2,000, now for $34.40 exactly. Well, 47. Well, you got to tip it. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Anyways, I feel really good. I think I've been playing my best poker since hitting the lab. I saw a couple people asking me like, "Oh, why don't you do videos of that?" I'd like to, but I think it'd be a little too boring. So I'd feel guilty making you guys watch me study poker, ranges, solvers. That's probably pretty boring. But anyways, I appreciate you guys as always. We've been running so well. There's not even words to describe how well we've been running in Texas, but that'll do it for today's session. I appreciate you guys as always. Have a lovely day. You guys take care. Stay blessed. Just stay great. Thank you guys as always. So stay happy, stay healthy, and more importantly, run good at the tables. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace.